Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pink Flame Podcast. I'm your host, Ella from Pink Flame Press. And today's episode, the first ever episode of Pink Flame Podcast, is dedicated to the wonderful ancient Greek poetess, Sappho. Now, Sappho is a figure that's kind of shrouded in the mist of time, but her influence on poetry and the arts has endured for millennia. I mean, I'm talking about her right now, so that proves how far throughout time her poetry has resonated with women. Sappho was born on the island of Lesbos around 630 BC, and very little is actually known about her life. And much of what we know about her and her work has been pieced together from fragments of her poetry that was found and kind of reworked by later writers. And like many women today, whose lives and work are shrouded in mystery and legend, she still proves to be an enigma today. So, to introduce you to Sappho, I'm going to read you one of her very few surviving full length poems, mainly because it is one of the only full length poems by Sappho that we have, but also because I really think as a poem, it really encapsulates her style and her themes that are often recurrent in her poems. So, it's also one of my personal favorite poems of all time. It really does influence my style of writing of poetry, and it's a sort of poem that I love to read. It has the big themes of love, longing, and it's got a very feminine lyrical quality, which is personally what I love to read in a poem. I'm going to read it. I'll attempt to do it justice. This is Ode to Aphrodite by Sappho. Deathless Aphrodite, throned in flowers, daughter of Zeus, O terrible enchantress, with this sorrow, with this anguish, break my spirit, lady, not longer. Hear anew the voice, O hear and listen. Come, as in that island dawn thou camest, billowing in thy yoked car to Sappho, forth from thy father's golden house in pity. I remember, fleet and fair thy sparrows drew thee, beating fast their wings above the dusky harvests, down the pale heavens. Lightning anon, and thou, O blessed and brightest, smiling with immortal eyelids, asked me, Maiden, what betideth thee? O wherefore thou callest upon me? What is here the longing more than other, here in this mad heart? And who the lovely one, beloved, that wast lord to loving? Sappho, who wrongs thee? See, if now she flies, she must soon follow. Yes, if spurning gifts she soon must offer. Yes, if loving not, she soon must love thee, how so unwilling. Come again to me, O now release me, end the great pang, and all my heart desireth now a fulfilment fulfill. O Aphrodite, fight by my shoulder. That is the poem Ode to Aphrodite by Sappho. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments, so please feel free to comment down below wherever you're listening right now and let me know what you think about that poem. Let me know what effect it has on you. So, yes, I would love to hear about that. Also, I'm going to start to discuss what is so great about this poem and why I love it and how Sappho makes this poem effective. So, basically, this poem is all about Sappho invoking Aphrodite to help her in matters of the heart. And I really love to talk about this poem when it comes to Sappho because her main theme in all of her poems is this theme of love and longing. It's really it's really what I think makes Sappho such a legendary poet. And considering she is from ancient Greece, this was something that a lot of writers and artists wrote about and referred to at this time. She really kind of popularized the genre of the lyric ode, and that was the form in which that poem was just written that I read, and also how many of her poems were written very much so lyrical and odes and hymns. That was really her style. And it made her very popular at the time of ancient Greece, which I will get to in a minute. But yeah, when it comes to the themes, she's really She's begging for mercy from Aphrodite in this poem. She's begging to be released from the pain of being in love with someone and longing for them. For example, in the final line, in fact, I will leave a link down below to all the resources that I've used for this episode, and I will leave the link to this poem so that you can read it yourself and maybe follow along, or just to really see the poem on the paper. But in the final verse of that, she says, "Come to me again, oh now release me and the great pang." And I think that is something that a lot of people can relate to, the feeling of maybe being in love and the pain of that, and how the longing is both pleasurable and painful. And I think that's something that really makes her work quite relatable, which is an extraordinary thing to do. And it's not like she was trying to be relatable, she was just expressing herself. But the fact that I can talk about that now and understand what she means, that's really testament to not only her ability to express herself clearly, but also to the test of time. Really is what impresses me the most, I guess. It's such a relatable thing, and such a, I don't know, it's just so vivid. I think also Sappho was a poet who really, her work was really characterized by its emotional intensity, and she gets that across by using very vivid imagery and a lot of exclamation. She uses a lot of exclamation marks and questions. I mean, she may not have necessarily written them like that because because a lot was lost over time. It is hard to kind of sometimes know if a writer has edited something later on, and then perhaps change the style a little bit. And of course, it is translated to English. She wrote in Aeolian Greek, which was from the northern and eastern parts of the Greek world. However, she really does get across the emotional intensity and the vivid imagery, like I said, with the exclamation marks, the question marks, and they really get across this sense of feeling lost and confused in the midst of this feeling. And she uses the word "oh" a lot. I mean, it's just the letter O, but it's very much so a call of pleading to Aphrodite, pleading to her, this great goddess of love, to help her. And I think it's a very effective poem because of the way it uses Aphrodite, which would have been, I mean, nowadays she's such a well-known figure, well-known archetype. But in ancient Greece, it would have been much more personal. There would have been a more direct communication almost to the goddesses, to the gods, the ancient Greek gods, because they were regularly prayed to. They were regularly direct spiritual connection. And I think you can actually really feel this in this poem. And because this goddess is such an all-encompassing kind of archetype for love, a personification of the feeling of love and all the emotions that come with it, you get this feeling that, especially since Sappho, as Aphrodite in this poem, refers to herself as maiden, this feeling that she's the small, powerless one to this great goddess, this great feeling. I think she gets that across very well. And Sappho herself was very much from a privileged background. She was a part of the Aeolian Greek community, and at Lesbos in this time where she was from, it was really a time of political and cultural flourishing. A lot of historical records suggest that she belonged to a wealthy and aristocratic background, so she would have enjoyed a certain level of privilege that allowed her to engage in these intellectual pursuits. And she obviously had very thorough knowledge of, the Greek gods and goddesses. She had time and space to learn about that. And being a learned woman was what was expected of her. And you can see that in both the quality and the content of her poems. She's obviously a very talented wordsmith, but also in her poems, there's a lot of references to other great Greek writers. And of course, Sappho herself was very much a respected writer of her time. And I think that's really important to understand, because it's not a case of Sappho being this posthumous legend, she was very much well known, famous, and respected for her work. And that sometimes may come as a surprise. I mean, she was a privileged person in society, but also we may think kind of because she was a woman, perhaps she wasn't as respected because Greece was a very patriarchal society. But ancient Greece was a place that placed a lot of value on the arts, poetry, music, philosophy. These were signs of a intellectual, learned person. And there's quite a difference nowadays, I think. I mean, I'm from the UK. I can't speak for the whole world or any other countries really, but in a lot of places, the arts, poetry, philosophy is seen as kind of less useful in society, and not as valuable. Whereas in ancient Greece, I think because those things are so valued, that allowed her to be a respected person in society and honestly allowed us to be able to read her work today and enjoy it today and learn about her time, her world, her emotions. And I think that's really, really valuable. And for me, I think it's really important to read things of the past. This is why I do what I do, because I think we can learn so much about ourselves, about the human condition, about the world from reading other people's writing, from reading their own experiences, just absorbing. It's quite how do I say this? It's quite validating in a way to be able to read other people's work and see the common thread of humanity throughout it. And I think poetry is definitely somewhat lost in a way, especially in mainstream society, because it's seen as confusing and maybe uppity. And I don't think that's true, honestly. I think it's become that way over time. And I think it deserves to be an art form that's accessible to everyone. So that's why I do what I do. And yeah, this poem is really one of my favorites because it is so relatable. And I think as women, we can learn so much about ourselves, our society from the women that came before us. And that is what I'm going to talk about in a few more minutes. Stay tuned. So, what can we learn from this poem, Ode to Aphrodite, and the life of Sappho with regards to womanhood? Well, we can learn that her themes of love, longing, and passion have resonated across centuries. These themes are so relevant and central to the human condition, really, but especially to the lives of women across time, across places. Now, her lyric poetry often featured a first person perspective, which enabled Sappho to convey intense personal emotions. And it's this choice that makes it something that the reader can directly relate to and resonate with, no matter who they are or what time they're living in. Sappho's expression of love, desire, and really the complexities of human relationships still remain extremely relevant and are what make her legacy so timeless. Now, her legacy for women today, well, Sappho's influence has extended far beyond her own time, as we've already mentioned. Despite the loss of so much of her poetry, which is honestly tragic, many fragments have continued to survive and really captivate scholars and readers. It's really something that's very impressive. I mean, I'm not sure if she ever set out to have such a legacy. I'm not sure anybody can, but it's really testament to her, the content of her poems, and the bravery and vulnerability which she had in putting herself out there. I think that's something that's hard for anybody. The fact that it still resonates with so many people. I mean, she's inspired countless other poets, writers, artists of all kinds, including me. And her impact isn't just confined to literature and academia. I mean, over many centuries, her life and her works have inspired so many artistic representations, such as paintings, sculptures, musical compositions, especially since her kind of modus operandi for her work was lyrical odes. It's really something that translates well to music. For example, in the modern era, her influence is clear in the works of poets such as Hilda Doolittle, and contemporary writers really who explore the themes of love and identity. I mean, like I said, I'm one of them. I'm really such a lover of this style of poetry, and I think it's really valuable in learning about this side of womanhood, about this side of life as a woman and as a human. And of course, I can't in any way talk about her legacy without talking about how she has impacted the LGBTQ community, specifically the lesbian community, because she fearlessly celebrated same-sex love in her works. I mean, that's where the phrase sapphic comes from. It's a reference to Sappho, and the word lesbian is a reference to her homeland of Lesbos. So the fact that her legacy is so deeply ingrained in our language today, language really displays the values and the most core ideas of a society. And I think the fact that she is kind of woven into our language is really something special. I think it's really interesting and something that should be celebrated. So, one of her most famous poetic works it's sometimes called several different things. And since it's pieced together, it's kind of difficult to find the true, in air quotes, the true poem. There's a very famous poem that I'll refer to as the Anactoria poem. It's a piece that expresses her admiration and desire for this young woman named Anactoria, and it references the story of Helen of Troy, which today we know about the story of Helen of Troy. Even if we don't know the story, we know of it. But it's a story that would have been extremely familiar to the ancient Greeks, much more than us today. And she describes how she would rather leave everything she has to see Anactoria's face again. And she does that through the story of Helen of Troy. So I will read it to you now, just so you can see what I'm talking about. This is the Anactoria poem. Some say thronging cavalry, some say foot soldiers, others call a fleet the most beautiful of sights the dark earth offers. But I say it's whatever you love best. And it's easy to make this understood by everyone, for she who surpassed all humankind in beauty, Helen, abandoning her husband, that best of men, went sailing off to the shores of Troy, and never spent a thought on her child or loving parents. When the goddess seduced her wits and left her to wander, she forgot them all. She could not remember anything but longing, and lightly straying aside, lost her way. But that reminds me now, Anactoria, she's not here, and I'd rather see her lovely step, her sparkling glance and her face, than gaze on all the troops in Lydia, in their chariots and glittering armour. Now this poem is really a testament to Sappho's willingness to explore and celebrate same-sex love. And the thing is, she wrote about love for men and women in her poems. But this is really it's a theme that really sets her apart in the context of ancient Greek literature. I also think she might be quite surprised at how we view homosexuality today, because in ancient Greece, sexual orientation wasn't kind of seen as a social identity as much as it is today in much of the world. And sexual desire itself wasn't seen in the context of the gender of the participant. It just wasn't really like that. It was a different way of viewing sexual orientation. And I wonder if this kind of allowed her to express herself more authentically and publicly than if this wasn't the case, or whether she just didn't care. I guess we'll kind of never know, given the fact that it was so long ago. And like I said, there's not really enough information to really understand that. But I think the poem is so vulnerable and clear and honest. It's the way it's written in kind of enjambment, which is kind of almost free verse, where you kind of cut the line off, but the sentence continues, is probably the simplest way I can say it. I think that really makes the poem quite accessible. And the the kind of using the Helen of Troy story as an allusion, alluding to her relationship with a woman named Anactoria, or just her admiration of this woman. It's kind of exactly hard to tell. Again, we don't have much information on her actual relationships, but it's so clear in her admiration and love for this person that it kind of overdrive everything else, I guess. It says here in the poem, I'll just go back to about the middle of the poem, and she says, Helen, abandoning her husband, went sailing off to the shores of Troy and never spent a thought on her child or loving parents. When the goddess seduced her wits and left her to wander, she forgot them all. And I think that's basically the clearest way she could have said that her life that she already has, she would think nothing of leaving it to see this woman again. I think despite how Sappho's life would have been very different to, say, the life of mine or most likely the life of yours, I think that's such an easy thing to relate to in the deep kind of throes of love or infatuation. And that desire overpowers everything else, the desire to see that person. And I think it really shows how womanhood has kind of often held the same dilemmas and beauty and struggles across time and across gender. You know, this is the first female poet whose work we really have access to. And honestly, the first, I think Sappho must be one of the earliest female poets where homosexuality is clearly written about. You know, there's no, oh, they were roommates. There's no mistake to make. It's clear what it's about. And I love that vulnerability, but also the vulnerability is so valuable for us to read now because it's so clear. We can so clearly relate to it. It's not complicated. It's not something you have to decipher. She's so clear with her words and her expression of love and her intention. It's so great that she was celebrated in her life as well as posthumously because, you know, she was really one of the first women whose words were publicly respected in the patriarchal society of ancient Greece, which was a great achievement in and of itself. I mean, she was very privileged in other ways, but at the end of the day, she was a woman in a patriarchal society, and she was referred to as the 10th muse by Plato and by the Roman poet Ovid, which really was a big public display of respect for her talents and words. And her work was highly regarded in ancient Greece. Like we discussed before, it was a society that really valued the arts and great thought and intellectualism. However, her talent didn't really need the validation of prominent male figures to stand the test of time. It's really women who have really resonated with her work. Again, that use of first person narrative, her use of enjambment, kind of very vivid imagery and clear vocabulary, clear writing that enables you to completely understand what she's saying without, you know, too much. You don't have to have a PhD in literature in order to understand it. I think that's why her work, despite only fractions of it surviving, has survived for so long and is still adored and revered enough to be analysed, to be pieced together, to still be cared about. And I think it's really, really heartening to show, because it shows how much value has been placed upon the words of a woman from so long ago. And that's honestly really why I do this podcast, because I truly believe that when women share their experiences, it really allows us to come together and validate themselves and each other, validate their own experience through their own voice. And it helps everyone to realize how connected and human we all are. It's when we don't share our most vulnerable parts that they get lost along the way and they get shamed, they get kind of covered up. And I think Sappho's example can really, really set an example for us all. Sappho today, I think she might be surprised to learn that women struggle to have their voices heard. I mean, we're about over 2,000 years on. I mean, I can't possibly know what she could have thought if I was to think about what she would have experienced. You know, women's voices are still censored when they talk about the issues that actually affect them. I think most of all, she would be surprised that people are still talking about her work today. So, this is how we can use poetry and the legacies of women before us kind of as a springboard to ask larger questions about womanhood itself across time. Now, I'd like to know what you think. This is the part of the show where I would love to ask you to send in your poems in reaction to the themes of today's poem. Since this is the first week, I'll explain what I mean. Each week, you, the listener, can send in poems inspired by last week's featured poem, poet, or theme, and how it relates to your particular experience of womanhood. I'll then read a selection of your poems and responses on the show, and we can all reflect on them to discuss and learn about womanhood by reflecting on our own voices as well as those of others. Please don't think you have to send in perfect finished work. Just authentic self-expression is all I ask. Instructions will be in the show description below. Please send them to submissions@pinkflamepress.com with the subject title Podcast Listener Submission. And now we've made it to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for following me on this journey and for following your own curiosity into the world of the amazing ancient poet Sappho, and of course, into the topic of womanhood. I've had so much fun and I can't wait for next week. If you've made it this far, feel free to follow and subscribe, leave the show a review and a rating so I know how you find it. Also, you can check out the Pink Flame Press website to find out more about what I do at www.pinkflamepress.com. And of course, send in your poems to submissions@pinkflamepress.com to join in the conversation. Next week, we'll be exploring the work of the amazing Sylvia Plath, another legendary poet whose life and works could be talked about for hours and hours. So I'm really looking forward to discussing such a talented and beloved poet with you on this platform. I've been your host, Ella, from Pink Flame Podcast and Pink Flame Press. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye for now.